part of the video series. We're going to continue working on our player movement. We're going to give our player the ability to jump. We're also going to improve our camera so it follows the player around as they move across the level. And we're going to tackle some problems that the jumping ability will create. Before we jump into that, I would first like to go back to the code. As you may have noticed, there's a lot of green text on the screen now. These are comments. As you work through your code, you should always provide comments, signified by these two backslashes. Comments are very useful because they let you write down what the code is doing at the moment. But given enough time, you will forget what the code does and you will have to relearn it, and that's a time-consuming process. Likewise, the comments are very important for working with other people. If someone else can't read what's happening in your code's not great, and you need to be able to create a space that anyone can work in and modify it if need be. Now, before we get into our player jumping, let's introduce a better camera solution that will allow us to track our player's movement. To do that, we will create something called a Cinemachine, which is a plugin inside Unity. To get it, we will first go to Windows, we will go to Package Manager, and in here you can see all the packages that are installed or you have the ability to install. By clicking this little drop down menu, you can see the different packages you can look through. In Project shows you everything that's currently installed in your project. My Assets connect to your Unity store. So if you have a Unity account and you're logged into your Unity, you're able to directly download from the store. And lastly, Unity Registry is the Unity approved plugins that are ready to go. So what we're going to look for is Cinemachine. So we can just go to the search bar and you can type in Cinema and Cinemachine will pop in. You want to select it and install it. It will take a little bit of time depending on your machine. So Cinemachine is installed. You can see it by this check mark over here, and you can always remove it if you don't like its functionality. For now, let's close the package manager and go back to our hierarchy. If we right click, we can now see that Cinemachine is on the bottom of our list, and we're going to create a 2D camera. This is going to create our game object with the Cinemachine component. If you look at the hierarchy, you will also notice that the camera has a little marker on it. That means that this camera is being used by this object. For organization's sake, we should create dividers in our hierarchy to make things easier to locate. So let's drag the virtual camera over here and let's create an empty object and call it cameras. This serves a very similar function as comments in code, allowing you to separate things and make them easier to read. And for now, let's create another object and we're going to call it others. We'll create better categories as we go on. Let's look at our Cinemachine camera. First, let's zero it out so it's on the center. Then let's look at these options. First, we want to make sure that the camera is looking at the player. So we can take our player game object and drag it into here. That way it will always center around them. Next, we want to make the orthographic size power of 2. If we look at our game, you can see that the player is a bit blurry. That's because the camera is scaling them in a strange way where the pixels aren't conforming correctly. Let's make this 4. There you go, much better. We won't need to adjust any other settings here. So let's test out our camera so far. As you can see, our player is now moving around and the camera follows. Let's make sure we stay on the game view and expand the body. So let's take a look at our body and what all these colors and lines mean. First, let's start with the simplest one. Screen X and screen Y is the position of the camera relative to this yellow dot. Right now it's set at half and half. We want to bring it up a little bit so the player is a bit above the center of the game. So we're gonna, like so. That's about right. Next, let's take a look at the dead zone. That zone is signified by these blue lines. If we increase them, you'll see that they actually separate and create an empty space. If we walk around, you'll notice that inside the empty space, the player is able to move around with the camera following, and the second we leave, the camera follows us around. This allows the player to mess around in a small space without actually having the camera move around and disorienting them. As you may have noticed, the player is not immediately stuck inside the box. The camera actually gives them some leeway on when they leave it. This is controlled by the dampening. If I lower it to 0, you will notice that the player never actually gets to leave the box. And if we go back to the 1, the camera follows around a bit. Depending on what kind of game you're making, you might want to change how it feels. For now, we're going to leave it at 1. Next, we can take a look at the look ahead section. Look ahead allows us to look ahead in the direction the player is moving so that they can see what's happening in front of them. For instance, right now when we move, the camera lags behind a little bit and it takes a minute for us to catch up, and we might not see the next obstacle or enemy that we are about to encounter. With the look ahead, let's increase it to 0.5, let's say, and you can see that the yellow dot moves far ahead of the player. You get to see a lot more of the game ahead of time. You can also increase the smoothing, so this is how long it will take for the camera to actually reach that point where the dot will be. So let's place it at 10. As you can see, the yellow dot takes a longer time to get to its position. Let's make this 1. So now that if the player keeps running around, they have a good view of what's going to happen. And we're going to click this ignore. Let's expand this. And we're going to click this ignore Y so that when the player is jumping, the camera is not flying up and down. The soft zone and biases control the red outlines. We don't really need to adjust them. We are only concerned with what's going to be happening in the blue area. All of the adjustments we were making were during gameplay, which means that none of it transferred over to the actual settings for the game startup. So let's go back and put them as we decided to have them. So your game should look something like this. Next, as you see, we have these big empty spaces that the player is looking at while the camera is focused in this corner. We don't want the camera to be looking at the empty spaces. We want them to be focused on where the action is taking place. So what we're going to do is create an extension by clicking add extension, and we're going to create a 2D confiner. 2D confiner takes some kind of collider, and that will allow us to confine the level within that space that the camera will look at. Let's create an empty object. We're going to call it level bounds, and let's zero it out. We're going to create a polygonal collider. Let's look at our scene. We're going to use a polygonal collider because our level may not always be a rectangle or square, so we want to create different shapes to define where the camera can and can't go. Alright, so this bounds our camera pretty well, but as you can see, it still hasn't done anything. What we have to do is go to our camera and connect this object here. Now you can see the yellow line signifies that that's where the camera is bound to, and we can see that the player is here. Oh, look at that, we forgot to do something. Right now the collider is a physical object, which pushed out our player from the map. So what we want to go do is click its trigger, makes it an empty space, and now if we click play, the player is okay to move around. So that breaks down the introduction of Cinemachine into our game. One last thing we might want to do is just put the level bounds with the camera since they are working together. And we can start on our next step, which is creating the jumping script.